In this video, we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, Section 1, which is all about classifying rocks. Now, there are two objectives that go along with this section today. The first thing you should be able to do when we're all said and done is list the characteristics used to identify rocks. The second thing you should be able to do is describe the three major groups of rocks. We will be exploring those three major groups in more detail as we move farther into Chapter 5. So right away, here we are with objective number 1. How do geologists classify rocks? Well, before we even talk about the classification part, what is a rock? A rock is just a mixture of minerals and sometimes other materials too. So in chapter 4, we talked all about minerals, and minerals had some very specific qualifications that they needed to meet in order to be considered minerals. For instance, they had to be solid. That's why we said water couldn't be a mineral. They have to be inorganic, meaning that they don't come from living things. They have to be naturally made. They can't be made in a laboratory, so that ruled out items like glass. All of those characteristics apply only to minerals. A rock is a whole bunch of those minerals all pressed together. So you could think, if we're talking like about animals, you could think of a rock as being sort of like a mutt, and a mineral as being sort of like a purebred. Geologists are going to collect and study rocks in order to classify them. Because they're made up of all sorts of minerals and all sorts of different ratios and combinations, there are some properties that geologists are going to look at first and foremost. When they are studying a rock, they want to not look at the outside appearance, but they're actually going to chisel into the rock and look at a sample from the inside. That way they're looking at something that hasn't been affected by the weather or elements. They're also going to take a look at surrounding rocks. They're going to see what else is in the area, because rocks take a really long time to form. And understanding the environment in which your sample formed in will help you to gather some other information about it. In terms of qualities, the geologist is going to look at color, they're going to look at texture, and they're going to look at mineral composition. That's just a fancy way to say they're going to analyze the different minerals and identify the different minerals that make up the rock sample. Geologists are going to use these characteristics in order to classify rocks by their origin. Now, when we say origin, we're not talking way back at the time of creation. We're talking about where this rock is at in the rock cycle. Is it currently an igneous rock? Is it currently a sedimentary rock? Or is it currently a metamorphic rock? It has to do with how it formed. That's why we say that they're classifying these rocks by their origin. Now, just like when we were identifying minerals, color is not going to be the most reliable way to identify a rock. We can use color as one of our factors, but we need at least one other test that supports our assumption as well. Texture is going to give us something regardless. It's going to be a more reliable measurement to look at, or a property to look at. Texture is the look or the feel of a rock's surface, and again, when we say surface, we're not necessarily talking about the part that's exposed, the part that we can see on first glance. We're talking about the interior of the rock, the part that hasn't been affected by weather or other factors. Most rocks, if we are looking at their texture, what we're really identifying are the grain patterns that exist in that sample. The grain is just all of those particles or minerals, those small pieces that are combined together in order to make up the rock. These little parts and pieces, these minerals compressed together, can be big chunks or they can be small chunks. Sometimes we see a mixture or some size in between. But when we take all those parts and pieces and we put them together, we get the grain that makes up the rock's texture. Geologists are going to describe a rock's texture by identifying the size, shape, and pattern of all these parts and pieces that make up the rock, the grain. Grain size can be broken into one of two categories. A rock is either going to be identified as coarse-grained, which means that those rock or mineral particles that make it up are large and easy to see. This picture of granite on the left is an example of a coarse-grained rock. Look at how large those white and black pieces of quartz and feldspar and possibly some other minerals too, how large they are in the picture. They're easy to identify. On the flip side, a fine-grained rock is a rock where all of those mineral samples that make up the whole are fairly small. Sometimes these mineral samples or mineral grains are so small that we can only identify them under a microscope. Here's an example of the mineral rhyolite. And in this example, you'll notice you can see some of the minerals, but they're far smaller than the piece of granite on the left. The shape of the grains, the shape of the minerals that make up a rock, can vary wildly as well. Grains sometimes are going to be smooth, like this example of conglomerate on the left. Sometimes they're going to be jagged, like this example of breccia on the right. I'm sorry I can't pass these samples around to you like I normally would in class. I tried to find pictures that were clear that would make it easy to identify. So again, this is conglomerate on the left, and this is breccia on the right. Just like a mineral has crystals that line up in certain patterns, and those crystals define how a mineral is going to break and how it's going to look, rocks also have a pattern to their grains. Sometimes we see the grains of a rock form in flat layers. We call this a banded rock. Sometimes we see that the grains form in rows. Sort of, if you think of like our halite, where everything was very cubic, we can sometimes see that in rock. But more commonly, we're going to see this random arrangement of particles, which we call a non-banded rock. So we have an example here of granite on the left that is a non-banded rock. And we have an example here of a mineral called schist that is a banded rock. Oftentimes, our banded rocks are examples of metamorphic rock, and you'll learn a little bit more about why that's the case in a later section. Every once in a while, we will stumble across a rock sample that has no visible grain at all. That means we can't see all of the individuals that make up that rock, all the individual grains that make up that rock, by looking at it even under a microscope. This sometimes happens when rocks cool very, very quickly. For example, this sample of obsidian here on the far left came out of a volcano, most likely, as molten material, and landed in a very cool environment like in an ocean or a body of water that caused it to cool extremely quickly because that water was fairly cool. Flint sometimes forms in a similar way. This last sample over here called, I'm blanking on the name, Scheidel, I believe. I will look that up and post it in the comments for you. Forms in a different way. It forms when small particles, something so small like silica, settle out in the water. Because these particles were so small, as they settle and compress, we are unable to see where one particle starts and where the next one stops. Determining the minerals that make up a rock can be tricky. We can't just pull them apart and examine them one at a time. Geologists are going to use a variety of techniques in order to try to identify minerals. One of the first things that they'll do is they'll cut the rock sample into tiny, tiny strips so thin that light can actually get through, and they'll look at the rock under a microscope. That way they can isolate individual minerals and observe them more closely. Other times, scientists, geologists, will perform tests. They'll use tests like the magnet test that we used in class to attempt to identify magnetite. They might also use an acid test. You weren't able to try this in class because we wanted to preserve our specimens, our samples, but calcite, if you add an acid to it with an eyedropper, will start to bubble and fizz, sort of like a baking soda and vinegar reaction. The acid test, adding acid to a rock, will help you to identify whether or not a mineral like calcite is present. The reason that geologists classify rocks is because they want to know the rock's origin. Remember, the origin is just how the rock formed. Based on how a rock formed, it gets put into one of three major groups. It's either going to be identified as an igneous rock, which is a rock that forms from cooling magma or lava. Obsidian would be an example of an igneous rock that cools quickly. Sedimentary rock, which forms when particles of other rocks, or the remains of plants and animals for that matter, are pressed and cemented together. They're pressed and they're stuck together so that they form one new piece. Those examples of conglomerate and breccia on the page, the slide about mineral shape, are examples of sedimentary rock. And then metamorphic rock is a rock that's formed when heat and pressure are added to a rock. And the heat and the pressure that we see will change the existing rock into something with new properties. It's sort of like a chemical reaction is happening in the rock. There are were examples like the schist on the grain pattern slide of metamorphic rock as well. Now, you can't watch this Geology Kitchen video on the origin slide in my presentation today, but I will include the link in the homework box on my website so that if you would like to go back and watch this Geology Kitchen video about the 3 major groups of rocks, you can do that. The homework for today is to finish up your note sheet, which was assigned yesterday. The note sheet will be due today at 2 p.m. Also, since today is the last day before spring break, I didn't want to give you too much else to do. There is a feedback form I'd like you to fill out, just so that I have a better idea of how this week has gone for you, of what you think went well, what was a challenge, so that after spring break, if we need to pick up online learning, then we can make some changes and make this an even better experience for you.